Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Meenakshi, and on behalf of NEN and Wadhwani Foundation, would like to invite you all for this webinar and also introduce our experts, Annie and Dr. Charles. They are a team of husband and wife who are the co-founders and principals of Cognetics Interactive and the Center of Agile Thinking. The Center of Agile Thinking was expanded last year with a joint venture created with Last Bench Applied Education based here in Mumbai. In addition to being entrepreneurs themselves, Annie and Charlie are experts in how to apply critical thinking techniques to create high-performing leaders and teams. Annie spent 20 years as an executive in the public and the private sector and was on the faculty of the Wharton School for 10 years, teaching courses in both business strategy and human resource management. She is a facilitator, coach, advisor, working with business leaders of companies of all sizes and stages of development. Annie has been recognized as a thought leader and an innovator in emerging workplace issues. Charlie holds 2 degrees in computer science and a PhD in cognitive psychology. He was a pioneer in user experience and interaction engineering and has been recognized as a thought leader and award-winning interactive designer. He has worked with hundreds of technology product design teams since 1982. In addition to being the founding editor of Use Experience magazine, Charlie was published in weekly columns for Internet Week and MSDN magazine. Before I hand over the floor to Annie and Charlie, here are the few reminders for the audience. You will be on mute. You may ask a question by typing the panel provided. Over to you, Annie.
Thanks a lot, Meenakshi. And Charlie, can we hear you too?
I certainly hope so.
Excellent. Well, we're going to get started right away because time is short and you're busy people. So let's just dive right into our topic for today, which is Agile Critical Thinking, getting to faster, better decisions. And we'd like to remind you to and invite you to type your questions into the chat box during our presentation so that we'll be able to field them as at the end of the session. Okay. What we wanted to do here was to quickly remind you of what we hope you'll get out of this session, which is to talk just briefly about the Agile Critical Thinking framework in order to give you a bit of a context, and of course to talk just a tiny bit about why critical thinking is so important as a foundational skill for all the other skills you're trying to build within your organizations, and then to get to something very practical about your own decision-making style and certain situations that make decision-making extremely difficult. So the first thing, I guess, Charlie, why don't I set this over to you? These are the questions we set up for our audience. We are going to talk about them, and maybe we can get some context setting about Agile Critical Thinking.
Okay, so we came up with 3 questions to focus on for today, and I think they are questions that you as entrepreneurs and certainly we as entrepreneurs have asked ourselves maybe hundreds of times. The first one being, how do you know that you're making the right decisions for your company? We make many, many decisions every day, every week, every month. How do we know they're correct? Secondly, what do we do when we don't have all the information we'd like or the situation has a lot of uncertainty? That's probably the norm. Rarely do we have all the information that we'd like, and rarely do we have the sense of certainty. And finally, as entrepreneurs, as we grow our companies, we have to rely more and more on other people. And yet we often have our own vision, our own way of looking at things, and we have to ask ourselves, can we trust the decisions that other people are making? Those are the 3 questions we'd like to focus on now. We have a framework which we call Agile Critical Thinking. As you can see, the letters make the word ACT, which is not accidental. We want to focus on the fact that the purpose of thinking is decision-making, and the purpose of decision-making is to get to action. The letters also stand for the 3 steps in our framework, which at the high level are very straightforward, which is to assess the situation, to consider the evidence, and then to take action.
So one of the questions you might be wondering is, what is critical thinking? And most cognitive psychologists and others will tell you that it's about rational, logical thought. And we'd like to suggest that while that's true, a lot of the thought about a lot of decision making is made on irrational decisions and on the emotional basis. So how does all that come together? So critical thinking for sure is the process of coming to a deep and accurate understanding, whether it's of a situation, problem, business opportunity, or anything else, that leads to sound conclusions and effective decisions. But as Charlie alluded to before, Agile critical thinking is really about what happens in the work environment where teams and organizational dynamics enter the picture and affect your decisions and their outcome.
So, Ann, what do you mean by team and organizational dynamics?
Well, we're going to talk about that in just a moment, but let me just at a very high level say that a group of people is not a team. A team really is around people who are focused around a single effort. They have a single goal in mind that they all understand. They all have a specific role to play in that success, and share that common goal. The team dynamic, as most of you know, has a lot to do not just with the personalities of the people, but just being in a situation of when you're with other people and making other decisions, that people would act differently and come to different conclusions than they would when they're working on their own. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. As Charlie mentioned before, the high-level view is very straightforward. There's nothing surprising here. I'm sure all of you recognize that at some level these are the three activities that you take whenever you make a decision, and I'd like to suggest whether you decide which route to take to work or where your product is going for next year. It's just that sometimes these things happen very, very rapidly and you're just not aware of it. But one of the things that we wanted to do in terms of this Agile critical thinking framework was to design a set of techniques around how you as a leader or a business owner can help your team to maybe take some of the emotionality out of decisions and try to, or maybe put some of it back in so that you understand what's causing others to focus on. So just to kind of summarize where we're coming from, I'd like to give you this visual to look at, because the thing that we're going to focus on today is not so much about rational thought. It's really around how can you become more aware of all of those other factors that affect your ability to make good, sound decisions, and what's happening and what can I do about it. So very quickly, they have to do with your own style and those of everybody else you work with, your biases, limitations, but also very real things around time pressures and resources, stakeholders, competing agendas, and also just the business environment that you're working in, that sense of competition, uncertainty, complexity, and change.
Right. I mean, I think it's important that we point out that we're not discarding rational thought and logic. Rational thinking, logic is the core of critical thinking. I think we all know that and we can all accept that. The problem is that in the real world, it's very rare that we have all the information we need, all the time we need, all the resources we need. As Ann's pointed out, there are organizational dynamics and there are dynamics even with a team that often make it very difficult for people to get the information they need and to make decisions in a measured way. And what we have been doing over the past 5 or so years has been looking at some of these additional factors that take place in the organization and say, what does it mean to talk about critical thinking in a dynamic organization?
Great. So I know that was a very quick overview, but we really wanted to get to some techniques here. But to sort of close up this section, I want to just point out that critical thinking is really the core not just of decision making and problem solving, but it's also the core of communication and influencing skills, creative thinking, innovation, strategic thinking, collaboration, and team building. And I just want to point out that sometimes it may seem to be a little bit counterintuitive that critical thinking, which is about logic, can be the foundation for creative thinking and innovation, but in fact they are.
That's right. I mean, if you're going to come up with an innovation, there may be some elements there that seem like serendipity or that they're coming out of the clouds, but the real question is, does your innovation make sense in the market and with the technologies that you've got available? And that's actually critical thinking. And the same applies to strategic thinking, which is certainly big picture thinking, but as well, at its foundation, you have to make sure that the pictures that you're constructing really connect to reality. So we believe that if you focus on critical thinking and you use the tools, you can actually be effective in all of these areas as well. These are the key 5 areas that we think are really important for competing in the 21st century.
Right, and so this is important, of course, not just for you, but it's important for the team that you're building and the team that you're working with. So the question is, how does your decision-making style affect the critical thinking of other people, the team around you?
If you are leading an organization, the way that you make decisions has a strong effect on the people within your organization. And very often, the way that you behave is the way that they will try to behave. And so it's really important to take a look at how you're making your own decisions, because the truth is that as an entrepreneur, we're rather odd animals, and we have a tendency to be different in our style of decision making, perhaps from others.
That's right. So we thought here we would take a moment for you to think about your style. And actually all of these are certainly there's no right or wrong answer, as you can see. But as you think about it, are you the type of person who says, I'd rather go with my instinct or wait for the facts? Is it easier to make decisions on my own, or do I look to other people before making a decision and try to get everybody's input before I come to one? Do I make quick decisions and move on, saying I can always fix it later, which tends to be the way a lot of us think, or to make deliberate decisions, meaning you tend to say it's important to get things right the first time out of the box?
I think, as you can see also, it's not uncommon for people who are entrepreneurial to go with the first of these. We tend to be instinctive, we follow our guts, we tend to be very self-sufficient, and we tend to be very eager to make a decision and move forward and mid-course correct if we need to.
Right, and I hate to say, we do often think it's just easier and faster to make the decisions on our own, and so therefore tend to go that way as well. And entrepreneurs, we have sort of a funny way of looking at things, meaning we really tend to see success and are overly optimistic about that success. And so it's something that we always have to think about. So when we think about being able to fix as we move, sometimes that can happen and sometimes not. Certainly in the software world, that's a little bit different than in other situations. So what we wanted to do next was to be able to talk a little bit more about what Charlie said, which is the need that you have as whether you're in a startup, whether you're all working with other people. And what's very important is to understand that at all times, even if you're all starting out as friends, working together, even though everybody seems to be equal, at the end of the day, everybody wants to please whoever they perceive the boss to be and not look foolish.
Now what that means is that you have to be very careful as to whether you can trust what people are bringing to you, because if their goal is to please you rather than to be completely honest and bring you the truth, then you may be getting the wrong information that you need to make decisions.
That's right. I've dealt with many CEOs over the course of my career, and almost always Well, they usually have two things that they'll tell you. One is they'll say they always know from day one that as soon as they sit in that chair, people will only start to bring them what they call green trees and blue skies, putting a spin on things that make things look a little bit better than they really are, and they hear a lot of "don't worry, I'll take care of it." And the second thing they regret very often is not firing people who were maybe not working out quite as quickly as they should have. So it's very interesting because both of those things have a lot to do with trust and being able to trust the people who work with you. But what I wanted to do is to just remind you about the two realities that really are very easy to lose sight of during the day. Two, as Charlie was about, everyone wants to please you, and two was that you set the tone for the entire organization, whether you realize it or not. And we only have to look to every big company to see that whoever is sitting in the top of the chair at the top of the house, that's the tone, that's the management style that is that's set going forward. And once you get that style set, once you start hiring more and more people, hopefully you're in that situation, your style begins to shape the culture of the entire company.
And I think what's important about that is for you to realize that what is the right thinking style for you as an individual may not necessarily be the right thinking style for your company. So, because you may be very instinctual, you may be very rapid, but at the same time, you may want an organization that is very data focused, that it looks at a lot of, does a lot of careful planning and a lot of strategy.
Right. So, you know, with every good thing to an extreme is not so good. So when you go and you look at those styles and you say, well, if you go with your gut, meaning with your instinct, what's the downside to that? Well, the problem is that other people may discount the importance or relevance of data. And by data, I don't necessarily mean hard quantitative data. It could also be qualitative in nature as well. So it's really important to be able to say, why am I making this decision? How do I know I'm right? Similarly, if you're the kind of person who tends to sort of go on your own and fix things later, what happens is that people stop offering you their views if they know that you don't listen to them and you don't really care about it when you're making a decision. Even if you ask them and they're politely but just never seem to take their advice, pretty soon they get the idea that you just really don't want it. If you rely on certainty and hard data when making decisions, well, the problem is that that's the killer of innovation, because the very nature of innovation is that things are untested and creative, may have not been done and so therefore there is no hard data to go by. So all of this presents a lot of challenges, particularly to early stage and smaller companies, because you're trying to do so many of these things and it's hard to know what the right thing to do is. So what types of situations make decision-making difficult, and how can we deal with them? Charlie, we started out talking a little bit about this, and I wanted to make the connection between being able to recognize situations that are particularly difficult and what you can do about them. Is there anything you'd like to say about this slide?
Only that the 6 factors that you've got on the bottom here, time pressure, limited resources, pressure from various stakeholders, the fact that individuals that you work with have their own agendas, and that there is a lot of issues around competition, uncertainty, complexity, and change. These are the things we deal with every single day, and we need to factor them into the decision-making process, which by its nature is inevitably going to be imperfect and not the beautiful critical thinking processes that you would find in the textbooks.
Right. As a matter of fact, that's a really good point. I think people say, well, why is critical thinking any more important now than it in the 21st century than it was ever before. And I think that's because of the nature of the competitive environment, globalization, technology, certainly the level of uncertainty and rapid pace of change and complexity of situations has really changed, as has the way that people are educated. So what's happening is that we see business leaders who are really struggling with the fact that it's hard to find the staff that really can grow with them and who has these capabilities. So let's talk about the first example. How do you know that you're making the right decision for your company? Charlie, would you like to try this, or shall I?
Why don't you begin and I'll
Okay.
jump in.
Good enough. Okay. Here's what we're going to do. The first 3 questions that we started out our session with, which were also on the flyer, what we wanted to do was to specifically give you some techniques that you can use when you're in this situation so that you can slow down the action, pause. I like to think critical thinking is when you press the pause button. You know, it's when you just think about, okay, how do I know I'm making the right decision? Now, that doesn't, of course, apply to every single decision. Really, you want to make sure that the decisions that are right are those that are going to be very strategic to you. They're going to cost you a lot of money if you don't get them right. They're urgent, they're important, they're things that are hard to go back on. And so that's why you want to focus on the strategic implications and the difficulty of making mid-course corrections.
Yeah, let me talk for a moment about mid-course corrections, because there's a reason that the Center for Agile Thinking has the word agile in its name, and it's not necessarily 100% the same kind of agility that we deal with in software design, although there's a lot of similarity. But I think in today's world what we have to realize is that it's very difficult to make a decision and make the assumption that the decision is 100% correct. More realistically, we try things, we see if they work, and we constantly are in a process of iterative refinement where we make corrections. And so anticipating what kind of consequences might come from a decision, understanding how we'll know if we're on the wrong path and how we're going to correct it is part and parcel of any significant decision that you might want to make. And one of the questions you should always ask yourself is, how will I know if I'm wrong? How soon will I know if I'm wrong? And what will I do to make that correction so that I can get back on the right path?
Well said. Okay. The next example that we have is going back to, what do you do when you have imperfect information and are dealing with uncertainty? I'd like to know if there's anybody in the audience, who does have perfect information. I'd love to know about that, and deals with a certain environment. I think that most of us can say that even if we think we have good information, we always try to have the best information we can. The problem is it's either too much, too little, or time sensitive, or not exactly the right information.
And sometimes it's because the information is really hard to get, but sometimes it's because other people don't necessarily want you to have the information.
Oh, really now?
Yeah.
Yes, so that I didn't mean to be sarcastic, Charlie. Tell me, what do you mean that people would only want you to have the information they want you to have?
Well, we live in a world where spin masters have refined the ability of doing influencing and trying to get you to make certain decisions has become an absolute science. And we are constantly bombarded with sales pitches. And then certainly within every business dynamic, there are lots of individuals who have personal agendas or individual agendas that they want to push, perhaps considering those to be more important than what is right for the organization as a whole or what the best decision might be. And one of the responsibilities that you have as a key decision maker is to be able to filter what is good, clean data from the sales and influencing pitches that are constantly coming to you. And understand that a lot of the data that you require may be missing and may not actually be available at all, so that you're going to need to make decisions without the kind of data that as an engineer or as a logician you would ideally like to have.
And that's particularly true, I think, of people who are in startups or own their own business. You know, everybody comes to you and tells you, oh, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, and if you did all of those things, it would drive you nuts. So you certainly can't, and you can't afford to do them all. So, so a lot of this is around focus. Dealing with imperfect information, to be honest with you, I think the very first question you have to ask yourself is, if I knew any more, or if I had better information, how would it alter the decision that I'm going to make? Because sometimes it's good enough, at least good enough for now. Charlie, were you going to comment on that?
Well, I think that's a very common situation. And I think the two suggestions you've got there, one of them finding a reliable source to get that information is always useful. Sometimes it's painful because you have to defer a decision that you want to make in order to see whether you can get additional information. And then often we find ourselves looking for surrogate sources. As a user experience designer, I often want to understand what, for example, what the customers and users are thinking, but very often companies will not allow me or have no mechanisms to go out and actually talk with them. So, for example, I will then have to go talk to the sales department and use their understanding as a surrogate for the direct information I would rather get through direct research with the customers.
Now, on that point, I'd also like to point out here again, just from the experience of working with, people over the course of many years, even people at fairly high levels that you would think would be able to do this, really struggle with being able to what I call back into a number, meaning that they can say, well, I may not know or have the ability to answer this question right now, but is there some other number I could use? Or is there some other data I could use that could help me? So, for example, one of the questions we work on sometimes is, how big is the size of a particular market? Let's say of the organic snack food business. Well, there's no exact number that's going to tell you that, but you can certainly guess based on, grocery sales of groceries today, what percentage is snacks, that kind of thing, and back into the number, which it's basic algebra to some extent, but people really struggle with being able to do that.
Right, and so that brings us to the second column here, which is dealing with uncertainty. If your information is imperfect, then by definition you're going to be uncertain about some elements of that. So I think your ideas for this are really good ones, Anne, which is to specifically look at the uncertainties that are affecting your decision, to try to understand the impact of those uncertainties, and then, and this brings us back to agility, to move forward in an incremental way to see what the effects of your decision is, and to iterate on that decision as much as possible. And that is really where the agility comes into it.
Right. I think those who are familiar with the Agile development process have a real advantage here because you're accustomed to iterative improvement. But really, one of the things that I think is extremely important is this number 2 about realistically being able to assess the impact and risk. We have to be really careful as entrepreneurs and startups to know what our own bias is, which is that we tend to be very enthusiastic, our ideas are the greatest ideas, and that they are hard to replicate, that no one else has done it before, those kinds of things. And also, startups and entrepreneurs tend to burn through cash very quickly. So sometimes it's very difficult, just by the nature of the beast, to be able to be realistic about what your impact and the risks to the organization is going to be.
I think it's also important, Anne, that people understand the difference between making good incremental decisions and waffling, because sometimes people have a tendency not to want to make a decision because they don't feel certain about that decision, and they may in fact avoid making the decision under the assumption that they're just gathering more data. And that doesn't necessarily move you forward. You can get into what's sometimes called analysis paralysis. And so I think the issue is to try and make sure that you are always moving in a forward direction, but that you have the agility and flexibility to say that a decision you made is not necessarily the decision I made a week ago may need some refinement this week.
Right. So, because we know we want to leave quite more time for your questions, we thought we would just sort of give you this last example, which has to do with being able to trust decisions made by other people. And as Charlie pointed out, once you get to a certain size of organization, it's actually pretty small, 25. You begin to get to the point where you do not know everybody personally. And people begin to see you as the boss. You may not hire everyone personally. Not something you always think of when you're starting day one, but hopefully it comes fairly quickly. And at that point, you really, really have to be cautious about decisions other people make. So we wanted to give you something very quick that you could use as a guide to whenever you're working with anyone on your team, that you can really ask them, one, what's your assessment of the situation? And what you're listening for is, are they telling me what they think I want to hear? Two, what are you basing your decision on? That's a good question to ask people. And what you're looking for on your side is, do they have the knowledge and experience to properly even evaluate this data in the first place?
One phrase you've used, Anne, that I find very helpful here is, how do you know? So very often I find it useful, and I've learned this from you, is that when somebody tells me they've come to a decision or they believe a certain situation is the case, I will ask them, how do you know? And the goal here is to try to understand what was their analysis, what data are they working on, and how did they come to the conclusion that they had made.
Right. Now that's always tricky because, you know, there are always cultural issues there and personality issues, and nobody wants to be rude about it. But at the end of the day, if it's your business, you want to know what other people are basing their decisions on. Another way to get at sort of the same question, but to do it a little bit differently, is when someone gives you a conclusion or tells you what they're deciding to do, instead of going through the how did you come to that decision, you could also say, how do you see this playing out? When you ask people, how do you see this playing out, they are actually thinking through their decision all over again. So sometimes it helps them to make the connection between the conclusion that they drew and then how realistic is this, how is this going to actually work out when you start to take action.
Well, I think there's even more to it than that, Anne, which is that it also lets you know, first of all, has the person been doing big picture thinking, which is to say, do they understand what your strategy is, and have they integrated that strategy into their decision making? Because in fact, as they tell you how it's playing out, they're going to tell you how this will interact within your organization and outside your organization. The other big piece about the T is thought about unanticipated consequences. Have they thought through what sorts of things might go wrong as they move the decision forward, and are they aware of things that could happen?
Oh, Charlie, you know, that reminds me of Shark Tank. One of the sharks last night was just that to someone, and he said, I don't like your plan, and the reason is because I like to think about what my competition would be if they were going to take me down, and you really haven't thought that through. And so that really reminded me vividly of this issue about looking for unintended consequences. And, you know, finally, agility. one of my favorite questions that I think is not only humbling but gives you one of the things about critical thinking is the core of it is intellectual humility, which is basically, no matter how smart we all are, how successful, we don't know everything. And so one of the questions that I often ask myself is, what if I'm wrong? And the real issue here is, how bad a decision could this possibly be? And if it's going to take down the whole company, well, obviously I wouldn't do it. But often decisions sort of fall into that gray area where they're not going to be awful, but they may not be optimal. So the issue really is around adjustment and how quickly could we have a plan B? How easily could we adjust?
Right, and I think this is another good example of how the Agile Critical Thinking framework can be applied not only to decision making, but to, in this case, analyzing decisions that other people have made. We find this framework to be extremely useful, partly because it's so simple at the highest level. But of course, as you take it down into more and more details, there are lots and lots of questions that you could ask about each phase.
That's right. So as we close up, I'll just summarize quickly by reminding you a little bit about what we talked about, which was that critical thinking is about coming to a deep and accurate, emphasis on accurate, understanding that leads to sound conclusions and effective decision making, and it's foundational to every other skill that you need to be one needs to be successful in the 21st century.
Right, and we've organized this as the Agile Critical Thinking Framework, which is a framework and techniques. And we've talked about a few techniques, but what we're finding is that if you want to get people to be more agile and think better, more critically within your organization, it's often important to give them lots of techniques and tools for doing that. And Agile Critical Thinking is a framework and technique for applying critical thinking in the workplace where you have team dynamics and organizational dynamics that affect decision making.
Right, and we've organized them in a series of how we've developed this approach is to enable teams, give teams the tools they need to be able to work on these techniques themselves, and that's as entrepreneurs, that's the product that we're involved with in the Center for Agile Thinking. But to continue on, this issue about your decision-making style affecting everybody else, I can't underscore enough how important this is, because no matter what you think about your style, you being an approachable person, a person open to new ideas, as soon as you are the person in charge, everyone will change, and this is just the reality of life. But what's most important is that your style is setting the tone for every other person that gets hired into that company, even if they have to adapt to it very slowly, and they all will. And you can see this in organizations all the time where everybody in a meeting you ask a question and everyone looks to the boss to see what the right answer is before they answer. And that's really, the importance here is around the opportunity that you have as an entrepreneur, as someone who's starting out in a business or building a big business, is you have the tools and you have the ability to create an agile critical thinking culture that builds a high-performing team. And I would say that that's the real difference. Being able to create that collaboration, that effective communication, and all built around critical thinking is what's going to make you a winner. And I'd like to say thank you for listening, and we've come to the point where Meenakshi will be asking some questions, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Annie. However,
yes?
We've got a couple of questions. First, one of the attendees wants to know, he's got his own company where most of his team prefers to go with their instincts, and he's more of a facts over emotion person, and he wants to
Mm-hmm.
he wants to know that because of this situation his team hardly produces any data or the fact. Is there any tip, or is there anything that you can suggest uh, to change this decision by gut mode of his team?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's a fabulous question. Um, so here's what I would suggest. When you have your team together, you really just directly say to people, look, when we make decisions, it's very important to validate our experience, our education, the things that we're calling our gut, the way we look at the world. That's very important, and we don't want to lose that. However, what we do want to do is to make sure that we're making sound decisions. So let's talk about how we're going to make the decision. What's the basis upon which our decision is going to be made? And this is what you're telling your staff. You set the rule there, but what you want to do is you want to get a little bit of benefit from their instinct, but they really need to have a discipline of being able to have more data. And so one of the things that we suggest is that you start with a discussion that says, how is this decision going to be made? What's the most important criteria for a successful outcome? And go ahead, Charlie.
I also think that from a cultural point of view, use the ACT framework. Part of the reason we made the framework so simple at the highest level is that it's very, very easy to communicate. And so it's really easy for you to say to your team, this is the way we make decisions in this company. We assess the situation, we consider evidence, and we take action, and we look at each one of those phases in order to understand what's going on. So you are recommending a decision to me. Tell me how you assess the situation. Tell me what evidence you considered. Tell me what action you're proposing. How did you come to that decision? How will you know if you're wrong? What are you going to do if you're wrong to correct that? And over time, that will begin to bring them down to understanding, hopefully, a different way of decision making. To some extent, when you are very, very competent, that instant decision making can be very useful. And some of you may have read Daniel Kahneman's, the Nobel Prize winner from Princeton's book on thinking fast and slow. But sometimes thinking fast is just a way of avoiding the hard decisions.
Great. Well, obviously, we could talk about this one forever. Meenakshi, do you have another one for us?
Yes. Give me one moment, please.
Okay.
Yeah. What kind of decisions can be taken by critical thinking method? Are they only limited to strategic decisions, or can daily-based decisions regarding any business format can be taken with the help of critical thinking method?
I believe that any decision can benefit from critical thinking. And there's sometimes a misapprehension that critical thinking means you have to go slowly and that a decision has to take a long time. Now sometimes, as Ann said earlier, we do want you to take a breath, slow down a little bit. But many decisions that you make very quickly are decisions that you can still think about critically. You could be sitting in front of a very rich dessert, or you could be sitting in front of a healthy fruit and say, which one should I eat? And it might take you a split second to critically think through the fact that it's a lot better to eat the healthy fruit than it is to eat the very gooey and fattening dessert.
Although you might go with your gut and eat the dessert.
That's right. If you go with your gut, then probably your gut will get larger.
I think that there is that misapprehension, and we just really want to underscore that everybody, even at this very second, you are critically thinking. You're just not aware of it.
That's right. And when you're critically thinking, you pretty much are doing ACT, whether you're deciding what to eat or which road to go down or whether you should do something now or defer it for later. So critical thinking can happen very, very rapidly, and it can also, be something that's very slow. You could have projects that take 6 months or 8 months or a year to get through. The process is the same at a very high level, but obviously the details become very different.
Yes, and just to underscore before we get to the next question, the amount of time you spend has to be worth it.
That's right.
If it's not something that's strategic, then you would spend less time, and you'd need less accurate data, and so a lot of this is around what type of decision you're making, which we'll leave to another webcast, I think.
That's a really good point, Ann. One of the things you want to do in the A phase or assessing the situation is to decide how large a decision is this, how much time do you have, how many resources should you put in it. Sometimes we find that organizations spend too much time making decisions where it's not warranted. Sometimes they even do that because thinking that you're making that decision is very comforting, and you feel like you're doing all sorts of analysis when in fact the best thing you could do is make a quick decision and move forward on to the next thing.
That's right. So being fast better, a lot of times the questions you could just ask yourself is, how do I know I'm right, and what if I'm wrong? It just can boil down to that simple. Yes, right. Go ahead, Meenakshi.
One question. How do we differentiate, or, when we know that gut-based and data-based both have their pros and cons, how do we decide which situation to go with, what sort of decision-making type?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to field that, or shall I, Charlie?
Well, I'm sure we both have something to say about it. I'm not sure that gut decisions and critical thinking decisions are an either-or. I think the reality is that at some point we all tend to go with our gut. At the end of the day, we have to feel good about a decision that we're making, and that it's the right decision. That has to feel right. The question is, what have we done to come to that decision? If it's simply an instinctual response without having thought through the data or the issues, then we're making the assumption that in our minds we're processing everything perfectly, and that's often not the case.
Yes, and I'd like to add to that, which is has a little bit to do with jumping to conclusions. Sometimes when we call something a gut decision, it could be something that's based on our training and experience, so it's really not so much gut as we think it is. It's just that we've learned, we know what the next decision is without really thinking about it because we're integrating the information. Sometimes where you can fall, where you can find fault there or fall into a trap is when you mistake the current situation for being too similar to the one that you are basing your decision on. So what I mean is, just because you've done something 100 times before and it's worked out well, the question is will it continue to be right in the future?
That's right. In other words, you become accustomed to seeing certain patterns, and those patterns lead to decisions, but I think what you're saying is you have to make certain that the pattern, you're saying, oh, this is just like that previous situation. You really have to look at that critically and say, is that true? Or am I making assumptions that aren't correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's another attendee who would like a very specific question to be asked. I often take decisions of hiring employees in my company. Well, I'm not in HR, so the issue my analytical skill to hire people and take decision to hire. The chances of hiring HR for my company is out of budget, so how can I make sure that the decisions I make are right? And how is it that I can keep my emotional level and the analytical level to hire the right people or the right candidate in my company?
Yeah.
So that we get the right people in the company.
Oh, that would be a great, great talk, a whole seminar unto itself. But let me try to give you a 1-minute answer or less. First of all, you have to know that this person is the best person you could possibly hire for your company, and somebody who you're not hiring just for this job, but for a few jobs down the road, meaning that they can grow into the job. So it has to be somebody who is willing to learn, able to learn quickly, able to adapt. Being able to fit in is extremely important when you're in a, have a small company. So it's hiring people for what they know is as important as hiring people who are willing to learn and their capacity for learning and adaptation. One of the problems during interviewing is that the interviewer tends to talk too much. And one of the things that you want to do is, if you see yourself doing that, stop. Because your job during the 1 hour that you get to talk to this person, who you will then live with for years possibly, is that you want to get to know them as much as you possibly can and ask them questions. Use the ACT framework. Why did you make that decision? How did you assess that decision? How did you come to it? Ask them questions that make, how do you see that playing out? Those kinds of questions can give you a lot of insight into how people think and how honest they're going to be with you, and that's what's very important.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things also to keep in mind is that as entrepreneurs, we are all ultimately salespeople. And we are the ultimate salespeople for our company, with customers, with investors. And during the interview process, I've often seen people start to sell their company to the employee or the potential employee, and then they make the decision based on how good a sale they made. But the risk there is that you end up with people who are always thinking the same way that you are, and that's not necessarily the best people for your organization.
Yes, I have one other very quick tip you can ask. You ask yourself, would I hire this person? And then you ask yourself, why wouldn't I hire this person? In other words, you ask the same question differently. Because I could say, would I hire Charlie? And my answer is, of course, going to be yes. I like him. He's great. He's smart. I had a great conversation. It was wonderful. But then if I ask, well, why wouldn't I hire Charlie, I might begin to see him a little bit differently and think about answering, and I'd answer the question differently. So whenever you're stuck between two choices, always ask yourself, well, why wouldn't I do it? Put it in the negative, because it does help to free up how you think about things.
Right. There's one more, there are a couple of more questions though. One of them is, what is the best way to take responsibility for a decision that resulted in project failure that will encourage the team to get into ATC mode next time around? And also, if ATC in a team demands an adult-to-adult relationship going between its members, how do you think to concede that people look at their boss for decisions almost all the time and not do it on their own?
Oh, those are two great questions.
Yeah.
Let me start with that's all right. Let me start with the first one. I was very impressed with the CEO of a very, very, very large multi-billion organization recently, and there was a failure of one of the executives, and who was well, there's no nice way to say it, fired. What ended up happening as the debrief is that CEO said, okay, we're going to go around this table, starting with me, and talk about what led to this failure.
Right. Actually, this was a group, just to clarify a bit, the CEO of this multi-billion-dollar company brought in the entire senior management team and said, we had to fire this gentleman. We have failed. And during this meeting, I want every one of you to know how you failed this person. Because it's not that he failed us, we failed him, we didn't make him successful. We were very impressed.
That's right. They didn't have preparation for the meeting, by the way. They were all caught cold. Okay, the next question is, you're exactly right. I'll tell you, in the business world, and I love the way you say that, and it goes back to the question that was raised earlier. I only want to hire adults. I don't need children. I have children at home. I only want to hire adults. And when I go back to the point I made about what you expect and the tone you expect is going to change the culture of your company, I really do mean it. Here is the way that you can do this almost instantly. Every single time somebody comes to you and they want you, we call that serving up here, where you're managing up, where the person who reports to you always dumps the problem back in your lap. You sit down with them and you say this. You say, oh, that's interesting. How do you think, you ask them first, what do you think we should do in this situation? If they say nothing, or they say, gee, I don't know, you say, well, how would you start? Where do you think we might start? What would be the first thing? And you keep them talking. It's very painful the first time, but you only have to do this twice. Nobody's going to come back to you the third time. So if you have the patience and the discipline to be able to say, no, you can figure this out. Let's talk about it together. How do you see this playing out? What would happen next? What would you do next? You can help them to state, what they think. And whatever you do, you say, great, I'm really glad you did that. You have to be extremely careful here, because any sign of negative or criticism will cause people to scurry back to their corner. So if your goal is to encourage people, then you have to live with sometimes less than perfect goings, but that over time it will get better.
You could just pick up the bag that you can.
Sorry?
The next question is going to be how to attract, one of my big decisions, I'm so sorry, I'm reading through all the questions. Give me one moment, please.
Yeah. Okay.
Should gut feeling based decisions have to be avoided in startups and early stage companies? Because what happens here is now people are really depending on the gut feeling more and more.
Yeah. You wouldn't be an entrepreneur if you didn't go with your gut. I mean, to some level, that's who we are. And I don't know. And don't kid yourself. There's not a CEO of a major corporation I know who doesn't, at some level, say, "I'm going with what I think is the right decision," although they will like to see the data behind it. But at the end of the day, the decision is going to be with their gut. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The question is, you have to say, how do I know I'm right? And the reason you know you're right, you can back it up and feel good about it, and you can answer the question, what if I'm wrong? 90% of the time, you're going to be in a pretty good situation. It's always, how do I know? That's the question.
Right. It's really important to always, when you make the decision, to recognize that you might not be making the perfect decision. Now, that doesn't mean that you waffle on the decision or you don't move forward with sincerity and with energy, but it means that you're being agile, you're keeping your eyes open, you're looking to see whether this decision is playing out as you had anticipated or whether there are unanticipated consequences, and as soon as you see that something needs correction, you jump in and make that correction. That's what agility is about.
Right. One more question. You know how tough and the startup businesses are. So one of the entrepreneurs want to know, when we get angry on some employees, is it right to reveal the anger on them, or it's best that we be diplomatic all the time?
Diplomatic all the time.
Diplomatic all the time.
Yes. Here's my rule, and let me explain to you why. This will stay with you for a long time. I have what I call the teaspoon and dump truck rule. And now what I mean by that is that you put on praise with a dump truck, but criticism with a teaspoon, and they are equivalent. When somebody hears criticism, it stays with them for a long, 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 long time, and they feel it as if a dump truck was just dumped on them. But the problem is they very rarely remember praise, not in the same way. So you have to be very, very cautious. That doesn't mean you don't say to someone that they didn't do something right, but it does mean you walk around the corner a little bit until you calm down, and then you go back and you say, well, we haven't made the right decision here. There was a problem. Now, you start with, where did we go wrong?
Yeah, and if you're an emotional person, it can be very, very difficult to manage your own feelings, but it is also very easy to underestimate the impact that you've had on people. And should you lose your temper, should you raise your voice, should you say things that are harsh, that can have an enormous destructive effect on people, and it also works against their operating with you in an adult-adult kind of relationship, because once you start yelling at somebody, you're now becoming a parental figure yelling at a child, and that's not the relationship you want with your employees.
Well, and let's not forget that that style will roll down. That will give permission. Now, of course, you're a startup now. Perhaps you may not have other managers, but over time what will happen is everyone else in the organization will feel totally comfortable yelling at each other and criticizing. And if that's the culture you want to set, and I'm sure it isn't, you would really want to avoid that.
Let's face it, business is hard, startup is hard, it's often very painful to be in the leadership role there.
And you're in one giant office with everybody.
And you're in one giant office with everybody, and it takes a lot of energy to control yourself, but it's absolutely essential.
I would say that I take many walks around the block, and we will leave it at that. Meenakshi?
Yeah. Yeah. Couple of more questions. We'll finish it up quickly.
Okay.
This question is, one of the entrepreneurs took a big decision which backfired. Now his team is a bit unconfident with his decision making. How does he convince them to work with him for his plan B?
Okay. You sit down and you say with someone, okay, everybody knows that things go right and wrong in life, and we all, with the best of intentions, make mistakes. Is there anyone in this room who has not made a mistake? Okay. Then you sit down and you say, in all seriousness, let's look at what we did. What was good about what we did? What went wrong with what we did? Now let's look at the future. And you say, well, you know, every decision in the future, things will go right and things will go wrong. So let's try to make sure that we keep right in front of us the things that went right, because we don't want to just forget about that. Some things must have gone right, but we don't want to make the same mistake. We've got to learn from our mistakes and not make the same mistakes in the future.
That's right. Every decision is a learning opportunity, and it sounds a little bit, silly to say this because we all know it, but that is the truth. Every decision is something you can learn from, and I think the question to ask the team is, what have we learned, and how will we avoid making that mistake?
Right, but focus on also what we learned that was good, not only what was bad.
That's right.
Yeah, remember that everybody will tell you, right? You see all these guys on TV who are entrepreneurs, and they all will tell you they learn more from their mistakes than they did from their failures than they did from their successes. So there you can find plenty of inspiring video in that regard if you need it.
Yes, it is very true that you learn more from your mistakes than your success. It's absolutely true. So we'll take one last question. What are your views on money versus ethical values? It's a very important question which is being asked many times by many people on this particular webinar. So within a span of 1 hour, a lot of people have asked this question.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to repeat it because it broke up a little at the beginning.
Okay. A repeated question is, what is your take on money versus ethical values in startups or in business ventures?
Okay. You probably are speaking to the wrong person, because I place ethical values as being very important. Because at the end of the day, you have to live with yourself and feel that you have to be able to look at yourself and say, I did the right thing. Now, that said, what may be ethical for you may not be the same as ethical for me. So everybody has a different set of ethics. That depends on, of course, the society in which you're raised and the family in which you were raised, your own personal experience. Everybody has a different sense of what ethics means exactly. But for me, I like it that when I ask people, what is the brand of our company, what does it mean? And the first word they say is high integrity. I think that means a lot, and it has a lot of value to me. So a lot of this is a personal decision, but from where I stand, I really believe that not every decision has to be made in terms of shareholder value. There are, I would say that a goal of an organization should be sustainability. It should be able to survive, to grow. If you want to sell it, great, but it has to be at a point where you can get it to that point, and you cannot usually do that if you are an unethical person. At some point, there becomes there's a price to be paid. At least that's my own view. Charlie, do you have a different perspective?
No, I also agree very strongly that ethics is essential, and building a company with integrity is, I think, what you really want to do. And I believe if you really think things through from a critical thinking perspective, you will come to the conclusion that high ethics is actually the smartest move that you can make. Now, we don't have time to begin to go into that, but typically ethics are around doing your job very well without causing damage as you go through it. It is possible to be a bully, to be a nasty person, to use many of these same techniques and to bulldoze your way to success, and there are examples of that all around. But it's not certainly the way that I see the business world or the kinds of companies that I'd like to create.
Right. It all boils down to values. What is important to us? What do we value? Because your values are what drives your decisions, and they are what drive your decisions of everyone that works for you.
Right. The session was really interesting, as being told to us by our attendees now. Thank you very much, Annie and Charlie, for this interesting session. Thank you, attendees, for participating in the webinar. We're glad the questions kept coming in. However, we could not, due to the time constraint, talk about all the questions. However, this is a good start. Maybe we can have another session like this sometime, maybe next month, if you're okay with it, Annie and Charlie.
Oh, yeah. And please, if anybody has a specific question that they would like us to answer, that they really feel, you have our email, send it to us. We're happy to answer you.
Great.
We really appreciate we really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Please do send in your feedbacks and suggestions to us at eclub@nenglobal.org. Also, if you found the session interesting, and feel free to blog or post about it. The recorded version of the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel by tomorrow. The place to see is www.youtube.com/user/eclub on NEN online. Also join our next webinar on hiring the right team in a startup, which will be the first week of February, the 5th of February at 3 p.m. Thank you once again. Have a nice evening. Thanks, Annie. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're glad you could make it up so early in the morning.
It's our pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.